The night had a way of settling over the valley that made everything seem older than it was. Wooden porches creaked with the sighs of time, lanterns burned low behind crooked shutters, and the sound of horses in the distance carried like whispers. Through the dark, folks in the village went to bed early most nights, shutting their doors against the cold wind that moved down from the mountains. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, where lives were measured not just in years, but in stories passed from mouth to mouth. And yet there was one man who seemed to stand apart from it, all like a shadow against the edge of the firelight. They called him the Lone Apache. He was 35 years old, though you wouldn't know it to look at him. The years had settled lightly across his face, but his eyes carried a weight that made him seem far older. He had lived among these villagers long enough that most had stopped asking where he had come from, but not long enough for them to call him their own. Some said he was a wanderer who had given up the road. Others whispered that he had lost everything in wars no one wanted to talk about anymore. He lived in a cabin at the far end of town, near the line where the prairie grass gave way to the dense pine woods. And though his land was rich with silence, it was silence of the heavy kind, the kind a man doesn't choose, but accepts because there's no other way. He worked with his hands, building fences, breaking horses, hauling timber when the need arose. The children watched him from a distance, curious about the man who spoke so little. The men respected his strength, but they kept their talk guarded around him. And the women, though they noticed the tall figure with the steady gaze, soon learned he was not one to linger. 35 years and not a wife, not even a sweetheart to bring him a basket of bread. He seemed content with the company of the land and the steady rhythm of his work. Yet in truth, loneliness clung to him like a second skin, so he would never admit it. On the night the storm rolled in, the village knew trouble was coming. The sky darkened earlier than it should have, the air heavy with that strange stillness that makes dogs whine and cattle stir. Families hurried home, pulling wagons under sheds and securing shutters tight. The wind started with a low moan and then picked up in fits, rattling doors and bending the tall grass flat. Lightning lit the far hills like a soldier's torch, and the thunder shook the ground until it seemed even the mountains might split. Most folks huddled close to their hearths. But the Lone Apache was outside, pulling tarps over his woodpile and tying down anything that could roll away. He had weathered storms before, yet this one felt different, sharper, louder, more insistent. He paused for a moment, standing there in the rain, letting it beat against his face. In that moment, he felt the strange weight of expectation, as though something or someone was on its way. And then he saw her. She came from the east road, her figure blurred by the sheets of rain, leading a horse that looked near spent. She was small against the storm, yet her posture was firm, her head bent against the wind, but not broken by it. The horse stumbled, and she steadied it, whispering something he could not hear over the crack of thunder. Her clothes were soaked. Through her bonnet nearly torn from her head, but still she pressed forward. Eyes fixed on the faint lights of the village, the Lone Apache stood in silence, watching her fight her way across the mud. Something about the sight stirred him in a way he had not felt in years. She did not belong to this village, he could tell that much. No one here carried themselves like that, with a mixture of exhaustion and unyielding strength. She was a stranger. A widow, by the look of the black ribbon at her hat, and she was alone. Alone in a storm that could sweep away weaker souls. By the time she reached the first cabin, the townsfolk were peeking from behind their shutters. They were cautious of strangers in such weather, especially women who appeared suddenly out of the dark. She stopped in the street, looked around, and for a moment seemed to falter, as if she wasn't sure which door might open for her. That was when her eyes lifted and caught sight of him standing by his cabin at the edge of town. Their gazes met, and the storm seemed to fall silent for a heartbeat. Something passed between them, not words, not even recognition, but something raw and undeniable. She steadied herself, then began walking toward him, leaving the village lights behind as though she trusted only the shadowy figure who had been watching her from afar. The Lone Apache did not move. He simply waited, the rain running down his face, until she stood before him. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words came out broken. "I need shelter," she said, barely louder than the wind. "Just until the storm passes." He studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he gave no answer right away. He had lived too long with silence to break it easily. And yet there was something about the way she stood there, half-soaked, half brave but entirely human, that cut through the wall he had built around his life. Behind them, the storm raged louder, rattling the trees and tearing loose shingles from roofs. The villagers, peering from their windows, whispered to each other. Some said it was fate, others said trouble had just walked into town wearing a widow's face. The widow waited, shivering, her horse stamping nervously behind her. Finally, the lone Apache spoke, his voice low but steady. "Come inside." Followed him into the cabin, the door shutting behind them just as the storm hit with full force. Inside, the firelight flickered across rough-hewn walls, casting shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. She removed her bonnet with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the room, then resting on him again. He offered her no questions, no explanations, just silence. But in that silence lay a tension that neither the storm nor the night could drown. Out. Two lives, one hardened by years without love, the other shaped by loss, had crossed in the most unlikely of ways. Outside, the storm clawed at the village, but inside that cabin, something more dangerous than weather had begun to stir. She had come seeking shelter, but what she would find was far more than safety from the rain, and as the wind howled, the lone Apache realized that his life, 35 years without a woman, without a companion, was about to change in ways he could not yet name. The storm was only the beginning. The fire popped in the stone hearth, filling the silence with little cracks that echoed around the cabin. The widow kept her hands close to the warmth, though her eyes drifted often toward the man who had led her inside. He sat at the small table, arms folded, as if he weren't sure whether to treat her as a guest or as trouble that had blown in with the storm. The room smelled of pinewood smoke and damp earth from their boots, but under it all was something heavier, the weight of two strangers who both carried secrets they had no wish to spill. She was the first to speak again. Her voice was softer now, though the tremble in it had not vanished. "My boy's gone," she said, as if that was enough to explain everything. "He passed last winter. Then the farm failed. The rest of the family, they didn't take to me kindly after." Her hands tightened around the edge of her shawl. "I couldn't stay." The lone Apache didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward her, but held back, as though he measured every word before letting it pass. Finally, he said, "This storm will pass by morning. You can rest here until then." It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't warm either. Just plain, like most of his words. She nodded, accepting what was offered, and let the silence settle again. Yet beneath her stillness, her eyes kept searching the room. The tools hung neatly on the wall, the shelves lined with jars of dried beans and herbs, at the cot, pushed into the corner with blankets folded sharp and square. Everything in this man's life seemed built on discipline, so it was easier to keep things in order than to let them slip into chaos. The wind outside screamed, rattling the shutters so hard it seemed the whole cabin might shake apart. She flinched at the sound, noticed though he didn't move from his chair. "Instead," he said, "storms are loud, but they pass. Best thing to do is outwait them." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she let a small breath slip out, almost like a laugh. "You speak like a man who's waded through plenty." He said nothing, but in the quiet, she could see it in him. Years of waiting, years of holding back, years of standing on the outside of things, even in a village full of people. It made her wonder why a man like him had chosen to live apart, and why he seemed as restless as she was lost. As the night drew on, the storm worsened. Branches snapped outside, and thunder rolled so close the ground trembled. Each time the lightning flashed, his eyes flicked toward the window, sharp and watchful, as though danger could step out of the storm itself. She noticed the rifle leaning against the wall near the door, polished and ready. Whoever he was, this was not a man unprepared for sudden company. She finally asked the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why do they call you Lone Apache?" The fire cracked, sending sparks upward, and for a moment he seemed carved out of stone. Then he spoke, low and steady. "Because I don't belong. Not to this place, not to their stories. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. It was enough for them to keep their distance. Folks here like what they know. They don't much care to welcome what they don't." Her fingers traced the weave of her shawl. "Maybe I know something about that," she whispered. Neither said more, but the room carried the weight of their words. The storm outside was fierce, yet in some way it was the silence between them that pressed hardest. When she finally lay down on the cot, pulling the blanket over her shoulders, he stayed at the table, staring into the flames as if they held answers he couldn't reach. His thoughts drifted to the faces of villagers who crossed the street instead of greeting him, to the children told not to wander too close. He had long accepted the loneliness, but with her in the cabin, it cut deeper. He had built a life out of emptiness, and now here was this widow, fragile but unbroken, reminding him of everything he had chosen to live without. By morning, the storm was gone. The sky outside was washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet pine. The widow stepped out into the pale light, pulling her shawl close, and looked at the wreckage left behind. Fences broken, branches scattered, mud thick on the road. The village was already stirring, men stepping out to mend, women sweeping porches, children splashing in puddles as though nothing had happened. Yet when the villagers saw her beside the lone Apache's cabin, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. Whispers began to spread like wildfire. Who was she? Why was she with him? What business did a widow have showing up unannounced in the middle of the night? She felt the stares cut into her, but the man at her side showed no sign of noticing. He walked past them as though their whispers were wind in the grass. Still, she could feel the unease building in the air. This village was not kind to strangers, and the fact that she had sought shelter with him, the one they already kept at arm's length own, deepened their doubts. The widow's horse was too weary to travel on, its legs shaking from the long fight against the storm. She looked at him, uncertain. "I can't leave yet," she said quietly. "Not with the horse like this. I'll work for my keep, if you'll let me stay until he's fit to ride again." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a single nod. "Stay, if that's what you need. Work if you want. I won't stop you." So it was decided, though no one in the village approved. Days turned to weeks, and the widow made herself useful. She mended clothes, swept the cabin, helped with cooking, even carried water from the well. She did these things without being asked, and though he said little in return, he noticed. Presence shifted the silence in the cabin, made it less heavy. Yet with each day, the looks from the villagers grew sharper. They were not blind to the sight of her drawing water from the well with him nearby, or walking the muddy road at his side. Rumors twisted in the tavern, voices muttering about what kind of woman arrives in a storm and stays where no woman had ever set foot before. Some said she was running from more than bad luck. Others said she had come with reasons too dangerous to name. The widow heard the whispers when she walked through town for supplies. She kept her head high, but her eyes told the truth. It hurt her. And he noticed, though he pretended not to. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, she sat on the porch of the cabin, sewing by the last of the light. He stood nearby, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the scrape steady and sure. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above the hush of the wind. "They don't trust me. Not here. Not with you." He stopped sharpening, lifted his eyes to her. "They don't trust me either," he said. "That's nothing new." She let the needle rest in her lap. "Then what happens when they decide not to trust either of us together?" He had no answer for that. And in his silence, the question hung heavy, as if the storm had only just begun. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and though no storm like that first one returned, the air in the village seemed charged, as if waiting for a spark. The widow worked, the man labored, and life carried on, but every glance, every whisper, every silence between them hinted at trouble waiting on the horizon. Neither knew what form it would take, but both felt it in their bones. Something was coming. And when it did, it would test not just their will to endure, but the fragile bond that had begun to form inside a cabin where once only silence lived. The days wore on, and though the storm had passed, its shadow seemed to linger in the way the villagers looked at the cabin on the edge of town. The widow's presence stirred questions, and with questions came suspicion. A woman alone, arriving out of nowhere in the middle of a storm, and choosing the shelter of the one man no one else would turn to. It was a story the villagers retold in whispers until it grew larger than truth. The widow felt the weight of their stares. Whenever she walked into the trading post, the shopkeeper's wife would fold her arms tighter. The men near the counter would pause their talk, and the children would stare openly before being pulled away. She kept her eyes low, bought only what she needed, and walked back to the cabin, with her basket hugged tight against her chest. The lone Apache, as the villagers still called him, would sometimes walk with her, though his presence only thickened the whispers. Together they looked like an answer to a riddle no one wanted to solve. It wasn't long before rumors turned into stories, and stories turned into warnings. One evening, as the widow fetched water from the well, an older woman from the village passed by and muttered loud enough to be heard, "Storms bring trouble, and trouble never leaves easy." The widow didn't answer. She simply lowered her eyes and went back to filling her bucket. But inside, the words struck deep. She had come seeking nothing more than a roof from the rain, yet somehow she had become the storm they feared. The lone Apache, for his part, noticed the change too. He had lived long enough on the edges of their world to know when whispers would not stay whispers for long. The men in the tavern had already started drinking, with sharper tongues, and when he passed by, conversations would go quiet, eyes lingering too long. He had learned to live with their distrust, but now the widow was caught in it too, and he knew it wouldn't end kindly. One night while he worked on repairing a broken bridle by the fire, the widow finally asked the question she had held back. "For weeks, why do they hate you so much?" Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly on the sewing in her lap. He didn't look up at once. The firelight carved hard shadows across his face. After a long pause, he answered, "Because I remind them of things they want to forget. Wars, blood, a way of life that scares them because it doesn't fit in their world. They call me Apache because it's easier than calling me neighbor." She studied him quietly, then asked, "And you never tried to change their minds?" He set down the bridle, his jaw tightening. "A man can only bow so far before he breaks. I don't live to please them. I live to survive." The widow said nothing more, but in her silence he could sense the weight of her thoughts. She too knew the pain of being cast out, though for different reasons. Her loss had left her drifting, and the judgment of her own kin had pushed her away. In him, she saw the same exile, though worn differently. Perhaps that was why she had trusted him that night in the storm, but trust was not the same as safety. Trouble was brewing in the village, and it came to a head one Sunday when the townsfolk gathered after service. The preacher's words had barely ended when a group of men lingered on the steps, their voices low but heated. The widow and the lone Apache walked past them, but the words carried. "A woman alone don't just show up by accident. Mark my words, she's hiding something, and Himmy's never been fit for this place." The widow's steps quickened, but he placed a hand lightly on her arm, steadying her. "Keep walking," he said in a voice calm but edged with steel. That night, back at the cabin, the widow paced the floor, her shawl clutched tight. "They won't let me be," she whispered. "I thought I could slip by, work quiet, cause no harm. But they look at me as though I brought the storm with me." He leaned against the wall, arms folded. "Let them talk. They've been talking about me for years. Words are wind." But she shook her head. Words grow into stones when enough. Mouths repeat them, and she was right. In the weeks that followed, the whispers took shape as something more dangerous. A boy threw a rock at her as she crossed the street. A man at the trading post muttered that her coins weren't clean. One evening, the cabin door was found marked with a smear of mud in the shape of an X. Each act was small enough to deny, but together they painted a message clear as thunder. She was not wanted. The lone Apache saw the fear growing in her, though she tried to hide it. He also felt the pull of anger deep in his chest. He had lived with their scorn, but he had never cared enough to fight back. Now, for the first time in years, he cared. That frightened him more than the whispers themselves. Meanwhile, the widow wrestled with her own secrets. She had told him only part of the truth, that she had lost her boy and been cast out by her kin. But there was more she hadn't spoken, and each day it pressed heavier on her. At night, when the cabin grew still, she lay awake staring at the shadows, wondering if she had only traded one storm for another. One evening, when the air smelled of snow and the sky hung low with gray clouds, she broke her silence. "There's something I never told you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He looked at her, waiting. She swallowed hard. "It wasn't only grief that drove me away. There were debts, it's not mine, but tied to the farm after my husband died. Men came asking for payment, men who don't care if it's fair or not, left. Before they could take more than land." He said nothing, but his eyes sharpened, dark and unreadable. She pressed on. "If they followed me, if they come here." Her words faltered. "You deserve to know." The silence between them stretched long, broken only by the crack of the fire. Finally, he said, "If they come, they'll find me waiting." It was simple, but it carried a weight that made her chest tighten. For the first time in months, she felt both relief and fear at once. Relief, because she was not alone. Fear, because now he was bound to the storm she had carried with her. That night, snow began to fall in soft white flakes. The village grew quieter, but the tension did not ease. The widow's confession had changed everything. It wasn't. Only the villagers' distrust they had to face it was the possibility that shadows from her past might ride in one day, demanding a debt paid in more than coin. And yet, outside the cabin walls, the villagers nursed their own suspicions. They had noticed how the lone Apache's watchful eyes scanned the horizon, how the widow walked with a new heaviness in her step. Rumors shifted again, no longer about storms and strangeness, but about danger that could spill into their lives if they didn't act first. Inside the cabin, the widow sewed by lamplight, her fingers steady, though her mind was restless. The lone Apache sat nearby, cleaning his rifle, each motion deliberate. Neither spoke, but both felt the same truth pressing in. The storm that had brought them together was not the last one they would face. The snow kept falling, covering the village in silence, but beneath that white stillness, tension brewed like thunder in the distance, waiting for the moment it would break. Snow lay thick on the rooftops and fences, muffling the sound of daily life in the village, but the quiet was uneasy. Smoke curled from chimneys, children played in the drifts, and men swung their axes at the woodpile, but behind every ordinary task was a current of tension. The widow had been in the cabin for weeks now, and her presence no longer felt like a passing storm. It felt like a choice. And choices, in a place as small as this, were rarely forgiven without cost. The lone Apache had grown used to eyes watching him whenever he walked into town. But now those eyes carried something sharper. The widow's secret weighed heavy in his mind, and though she had trusted him enough to share it, he knew it wasn't only her burden anymore. If the men who claimed her husband's debts ever came looking, the village would see her as the cause, but him as the shield standing in their way, and a shield always catches the blow meant for someone else. One morning, when the snow had hardened into a crust that cracked under boots, the first sign of trouble came. A rider appeared at the far edge of the valley, moving slow, a black shape against the white. He wore a long coat, his horse weary, and though he made no move to enter the village, he lingered by the crossroads for hours. Some of the villagers saw him from their windows and carried word quickly. By evening, it was already said that a stranger had been scouting, that he'd been seen writing something down in a small book. Whispers connected him to the widow without proof, but proof was not what the villagers needed. Suspicion was enough. That night, the lone Apache sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with steady hands. The widow stood by the fire, twisting her shawl until the fabric nearly tore. "It's them," she whispered. "I know it. They found me." He lifted his eyes, but kept his voice calm. "One man doesn't mean them all. But one man leads to another," she said, her breath shaking. "They don't forget what's owed." He didn't argue. Deep down, he believed her. The rider at the crossroads wasn't just a wanderer. Men didn't sit in the cold for hours without reason. The next day, 2 more strangers appeared, riding in from the same road. They didn't come into the village either, but they camped within sight of the hills. By nightfall, the tavern was full of talk. Some said the men were bounty hunters. Others swore they were after the lone Apache himself. Either way, the story grew teeth, and the villagers sharpened them with every telling. The widow felt it in the way doors shut as she passed, the way children were pulled back by their mothers when she came near. She tried to keep her head high, but fear gnawed at her. At night, she dreamed of men breaking down the cabin door, of debts written in fire instead of ink. She woke with her heart pounding, and every time she turned, she found him awake too, sitting in the chair by the door, watching the darkness like it might move against them at any moment. Days turned into a week, and the strangers stayed. They didn't threaten, they didn't approach, but their very presence was enough. The villagers gathered in whispers outside the church, talking about how long they could live with danger sitting on their doorstep. One evening, as the snow began to fall again, a group of men finally came to the cabin. The widow froze when she saw them coming across the yard, their shapes dark against the white. The lone Apache stepped out before they reached the porch, his shoulders broad, his rifle leaning against the wall, but not in his hands. The men stopped a few paces back. Their leader, a tall farmer with hard eyes, spoke first. "We need answers. Who are they? Why are they here? And why do they keep watching our town like wolves?" The lone Apache said nothing at first, only studied the men, his face unreadable. Finally he said, "They're not here for you." The farmer's jaw tightened. "That don't make it any better. Danger close by is danger all the same. Trouble follows that woman. It follows you too. And we won't have it falling on our children." From the doorway, the widow clutched her shawl, her voice trembling but clear. "I never meant to bring harm here. I thought I'd outrun them. Thought I was free of it." The farmer's eyes flicked to her, then back to the man standing guard. "You care for this town? You'll see she moves on. If not, you'll answer for what happens." The words hung like frost in the air, sharp and cold. Then the men turned and walked back into the snow, leaving silence behind. That night, the widow sat by the fire, her eyes red with unshed tears. "I should go," she whispered. "They're right. This is my burden, and you've carried enough." Already, but he shook his head, his voice steady as stone. "You leave now. You'll meet them out on the road alone. They'll smell weakness and close in. Here at least, there's ground to stand on." She looked at him, her lips trembling, but she said no more. The tension in the village grew tighter each day like rope pulled to taut. Strangers camped in. The hills, villagers watching from behind shutters, and in the middle stood a widow and the man they called Lone Apache. The winter sky pressed low, heavy with snow, as though the world itself was waiting for the break. One evening, just as dusk settled, a fire was spotted in the distance. Not a campfire bigger, angrier. Someone's wagon burned on the far side of the valley. The villagers rushed to put it out, but by the time they arrived, it was nothing but charred wood and black smoke. Tracks in the snow showed horses had come and gone fast. Some swore it was the strangers. Others said it was a warning meant for the village. That night, fear boiled over. In the tavern, voices shouted, fists slammed tables, and names were spoken. The widow's name, the lone Apache's name. Words like curse and burden and danger flew through the air until it was clear. They weren't just afraid of the strangers anymore. They were ready to turn against their own. Back at the cabin, the widow sat at the window, staring out at the dark line of hills. "They'll come tonight," she whispered. "I can feel it." He stood behind her, hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. "Then we'll be ready." The wind howled through the pines, rattling the shutters, carrying the sound of distant hoofbeats that might have been nothing or might have been everything. She rose, her hands trembling, and for a moment she pressed her face into her shawl, breathing hard. When she looked up again, her eyes were wet but fierce. "I won't run this time," she said. He met her gaze, and though he didn't speak, Something in his silence told her he believed her. The fire burned low, the night deepened, and every sound outside seemed sharper: the crunch of snow, the creak of branches, the whisper of the wind. The cabin walls felt thinner, the shadows heavier. Somewhere beyond the hills, men were waiting, watching, planning their move. And in the village, fear had twisted itself into anger, ready to burst. The widow sat by the hearth, her needle forgotten. In her lap, listening to the steady rhythm of the lone Apache sharpening his blade, every scrape against the whetstone sounded like a clock counting down. The storm that had brought her here had passed long ago. Now, another storm, far darker, was about to break. And when it did, neither she nor the man who had given her shelter would be able to stand apart from it. The night pressed down heavy, the kind of night when every sound carried like a warning. The widow sat with her shawl pulled close, her eyes fixed on the fire, though her mind was far beyond the cabin walls. The lone Apache stood near the door, rifle leaning against the frame, his body still but alert. Hours passed slow, each tick of silence making the air feel tighter. Then came the sound they had been waiting for: hoofbeats on the snow, steady and sure. Not the aimless passing of travelers, but the approach of men with purpose. The widow's breath caught. "They've come," she whispered. He gave a single nod, his jaw hardening. He had faced storms, wars, and solitude, but this was different. This was the moment where everything he had chosen to live apart, to keep to silence, was being tested. For years he had stood alone, but tonight he was no longer alone. Tonight he carried her burden as if it were his own. The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the cabin. Voices murmured low and sharp. Then a fist struck the door, shaking it on its hinges. "Come out," a voice demanded. "You know she's in there. Debts don't die with a man, and neither do promises." The widow rose, trembling, but he raised a hand. "Stay behind me." When he opened the door, the cold swept in, carrying the sight of 3 men on horseback. Their faces were rough with road and greed, their eyes locked on the cabin like wolves staring at prey. One man dismounted, stepping closer, a smirk curling his lips. "You're hiding her?"
"A choice."
"Hand her over, and maybe we leave you standing." Lone Apache didn't flinch. "She owes you nothing." The man laughed, though the sound was brittle. "Her husband did. That makes it hers now. Law or no law, we collect." Inside, the widow clutched her shawl tighter, her heart hammering. She had feared this moment since the day she left the farm, but fear had worn into something sharper: now resolve. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. "You'll have nothing from me. Not land, not coin, not blood. The leaders." Smirk faded. He spat into the snow and took a step closer. But before he could speak again, the lone Apache leveled his gaze, sharp as the rifle leaning against the wall. "She stays," he said, his tone steady as iron. Tension snapped like a drawn bowstring. The men shifted, hands brushing the butts of their pistols, the horses snorting clouds into the night air. For a long breath, it seemed blood would spill right there in the snow. But then, from the shadows beyond, lanterns flickered. Villagers had gathered, drawn by the voices, the hoofbeats, the storm of conflict they had long been whispering about. The outsiders glanced toward the crowd, their smirks faltering. Strength in numbers had always been their weapon, but now the numbers weren't theirs. Still, the villagers did not step forward. They stood at a distance, watching, torn between fear and the unspoken question of whether this fight was theirs to claim. The lone Apache's voice carried into the cold. "You've had your warning, leave." The silence stretched. Then the leader hissed through his teeth, turned sharply, and mounted his horse. "This isn't done," he spat. "We'll be back, and when we come, no one will stand in the way." With that, the men rode off into the night, their silhouettes swallowed by snow and darkness. The villagers lingered, their lanterns glowing like stars across the white ground. For the first time, they did not look at the lone Apache with only suspicion. They had seen him stand between danger and the village, between cruelty and the widow. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed of their whispers. Others nodded faintly, and Unspoken acknowledgement that the man they had kept at arm's length was perhaps the only shield they had when the storm truly came. Back inside, the widow sank into the chair by the fire, her hands shaking too hard to sew or hold a cup. He placed the rifle back against the wall and sat across from her. Neither spoke for a long while, the crackle of flames the only sound between them. At last she whispered, "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to choose me." His eyes held hers, steady and quiet. "I've lived 35 years without choosing anyone." It was long enough. The words hung in the air, simple but unshakable. She felt the truth of them deep in her bones. He had been alone not by chance, but by choice until the storm had brought her to his door. Though the danger wasn't gone, though debts and threats still loomed, she knew they were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance. They were something stronger, forged in silence and fire. The following days passed with heavy watchfulness. The strangers did not return, but the memory of their threat lingered like smoke. The widow worked as always, mending clothes, tending to the fire, her steps steady now instead of restless. A lone Apache kept to his tasks, though his eyes often scanned the horizon, searching for the shadows he knew might one day come back. The villagers, too, shifted slowly. Suspicion softened into something closer to respect. When she came into the trading post now, the shopkeeper's wife no longer folded her arms so tight. When he passed through town, men no longer stopped their talk, but nodded faintly, acknowledging what they had seen. Wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was the first step toward something more than exile. One evening, as winter began to give way to the first stirrings of spring, the widow stood on the porch, watching the snow melt run. In small rivers, through the yard, the air smelled of pine and earth, alive again after months of cold. She turned to him, her voice quiet but certain. "Maybe we can stay. Maybe this can be home." He looked out across the valley, the hills bathed in the soft light of dusk. For years he had built his life on silence, on distance, on standing apart. But now, with her beside him, the land no longer felt like exile. It felt like ground worth standing on. He nodded, a small but steady answer. The past had not vanished. The strangers might return. The villagers might never fully forget what they had once believed. But storms do not last forever, and sometimes the fiercest nights lead to mornings, clear enough to begin again. The widow reached for his hand, her fingers trembling but warm. He didn't pull away. Together, they stood on the porch of the cabin, the place where silence had lived for so long, and watched the valley breathe again with life. For 35 years, he had walked alone, his heart closed against a world that did not want him. But when the storm had carried her to his door, everything had changed. She had come seeking only shelter, but what they had found was something stronger than safety. They had found a reason to endure, a reason to fight, and perhaps at last, a reason to belong. And as the wind shifted through the pines, carrying with it the promise of another season, the lone Apache knew his days of living without a woman, without a companion, without a place, were over. He was no longer just the man apart. He was the man who had chosen, and who had been chosen in return. The storm had ended, but its memory would remain not as a warning, but as the night when everything began.